It's very short. And it's going to be for 40% of your module grade. Bear with me a second. Let me just double check the date. I'm pretty sure it's February the 13th. And really, I've designed this in a way that means I want you to be able to draw on your own experience. And I've developed the kind of question that you might be asked in job experiences. So quite often, graduate scheme application forms, if you've already done one, you'll know this, they ask you questions about your experiences. They say things like, tell us a time where you had to work in a team and resolve something difficult. Or tell us about a time where you had to learn from a mistake that you made. They ask questions of you like that. And part of that is because they want to know about your experience. And part of that is because they want to understand whether or not you can reflect on your experience and go through this process of learning from it that we've talked about today. So part of the reason I've done this is because A, it's a really useful leadership skill to be able to reflect on your experience, and it's one that organizations and employers really value. But also because these kinds of questions are kind of the things that organizations will expect you to be able to talk to at job interviews, on application forms. So I'm kind of thinking that actually this might be quite a valuable exercise for you anyway, although they're not really going to be necessarily asking you about your understanding of theory. They are going to be asking you to reflect on your experiences. Okay. This is going to be submitted online, and a link is going to be put on the Ellie page where you will be able to submit this piece of work. The deadline is going to be the 13th of February at 3 o'clock. So that's the deadline. Please, please, please give yourself lots of time before. Don't leave it till 2:30, because if Ellie cuts out or something awful happens, then you'll give yourself loads of stress. So please remember, plenty of time before 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 13th of February. So it's not very long, but seeing as you've only got 1,000 words to write, that should be fine. So as I said, it's really focusing on grad scheme type applications where they ask you to reflect on your ability, on your experiences. It's a chance to practice that, but it's also a chance to engage with some of the readings on self-leadership. So I will be expecting you in this assessment to link your background reading that you do for this module on self-leadership and sense-making to your reflections. So it's not just about reflecting. If you just write from your experience, you're not going to get a very good grade. What is going to get you a really good grade is the way that you balance those reflections with your background reading from the module. Okay? And that's going to really enhance what you do. And this is the brief now. Okay? So I'm asking you to identify a challenge that you have experienced in your life that required you to practice self-leadership. So given everything that we've spoken about today, that does not have to be a situation where you are leading someone else. It's about a time when you led yourself, a time where you regulated your own actions in order to achieve a particular goal. Now that can be something really enormous. It can be like you decided to locate the source of the Amazon and went on a trek somewhere, or you went to climb Everest, I don't mind. It can be, oh God, I had an 8:30 lecture and I'm really not a morning person. What matters to me is not the scale of the experience, it is the ability that you have to reflect and evidence your understanding of the research literature. Yep?
In terms of the readings, how many do you expect?
I'll come on to that in a little bit. That is a super common question, so it's a good thing to be thinking about. I'll come on in just a little bit. So that's the first bit of your question, right? Identify a challenge. And tell me about that. Explain to me why it required you to practice self-leadership. The second bit of your question is, what were the most important influences in your sense-making during this practice? So think back to what I was saying earlier about the social cues, the cues that help us form a picture of what's going on so that we can make decisions. What were the important cues in that experience? What were the frames that filtered everything that you interpreted. So in other words, this question is going to require you to have a really good understanding of the self-leadership literature, the techniques, the behavioral and psychological strategies that we use to motivate and regulate ourselves. And I'm asking you to bring in your understanding of sense-making. That is, how did you go about interpreting what was going on, which led you then to regulate your actions in a particular way? Does that make sense? I'm asking you to combine those things in your interpretation of how you responded to a particular challenge. The challenge itself could be anything. It doesn't have to be anything that makes you out to be this amazing, heroic individual. It can be something really minor, but that you learned from, or that you had to regulate yourself, you had to work hard for. As a final part of the assignment, I'm going to ask you to fill out this sheet. This is an extract from your course textbook. So you'll find this in your course textbook. It's also on Ellie, and I'm giving them out here. This is a sheet, it shouldn't take you long to do, but it's a reflection on your self-leadership. So it's going to help you identify how good you are at self-leadership, where you do it in your life, and try and invite you to kind of evaluate yourself in terms of what are you good at, what are you not good at. This is really not going to take you very long to do. I suggest you just type it out and attach it on the last page of your assessment. It will probably, you don't have to type out the whole thing, just type out this bit here that says, what does leading yourself mean to you? And write a 2-sentence answer. So you don't need to spend hours, you don't have to write another essay or anything, but this is just an opportunity for you to reflect a little bit more, to give me a bit more context that's going to help me understand what's going on in your actual answer to your essay. Does that make sense? Okay? So,
Does it count in the word count?
that bit does not count in the word count. Only thing that counts in your word count is the bit between the heading and the bibliography. Yeah.
Is it
The 2 sections, yeah, there's 2 boxes there. The first one says, what does leading yourself mean to you? What is it and why does it matter? I'm not expecting more than a couple of sentences for that. And then it says, what evidence would you give in a job application or interview for your ability to lead yourself? And that is really kind of more of a prep for later. People ask you, people will ever say to you, how can you demonstrate determination? How can you demonstrate that you've applied yourself to something? You're going to have an answer ready-made because you've done it right here. Okay? So this is going to take you 5 minutes. In fact, you could probably do it while I'm talking. So don't worry too much about this. I'm not going to be marking how good you are at self-leadership. What I'm going to be marking is how able are you to use the literature and apply it to your circumstance. Okay, so here's what I'm going to be looking for when I mark your work. I'm going to be thinking, well, does this person, do they show an ability to reflect and explain what's going on in their context? Are they going to be able to provide an explanation as to why this was a challenge of some kind? And can they tell me enough about it so that I understand their response to it? And then I want to be able to think about your self-leadership practice. So in other words, what kind of strategies are you using? What are your extrinsic and intrinsic motivations? What are the behavior regulation practices that you undertook? How did you think about improving the way that you talked to yourself? Did you use power poses? Were you conscious of trying to psych yourself up, to encourage yourself? Did you use positive mental imagery? That's really popular in sport, to use kind of really positive imagery to kind of imagine yourself winning stuff. So what kind of techniques did you use? Remember to go back to the reading, go back to the lecture slides, show me why and how this is proven to help people engage in self-leadership. That's the first part, right? That's going to be half, roughly, of your 1,000 words. The other half is going to be thinking about the sense-making, about the bigger context. And so for that, I will expect you to maybe draw in a couple of sense-making references. I put lots and lots in the reading list for you. Please don't try and read them all. You really don't need to read them all. But a few Remember that sense-making crib sheet that I've also put on Ellie? That's going to help too. But I want you to think about your experience of self-leadership as a stream and think, well, what are the bits that you picked out as being really fundamentally important here that helped you interpret a picture of what's going on and helped you navigate a way through that? Because that's what effectively sense-making is, right? We've got the small pictures, the small things that contributed to our understanding. And we've also got the bigger picture of our sense of purpose, our values, our family upbringing. Those are big things. Those are frames that funnel and filter everything that we interpret in our lives. So in order to get a really good grade, what I'm looking for is evidence that you really understand the readings on self-leadership and sense-making, that you have been able to apply them to your own experience in an original way. Some people, depending on whether it's relevant, you might find that other things come in. So power imbalances. We talk about power in a couple of weeks, but that might be relevant for your sense-making. Does power mean that you see certain things in your experience and not others? Quite a lot of the time it does. So to get an outstanding grade, what I'd like to see is a really detailed discussion. The more detail you can offer me in terms of theory and in terms of your own reflections, the better. Okay? One of the things, so these are some examples of things you could include. So for example, the self-leadership techniques you use to motivate yourself, how you talk to yourself, how you encourage yourself, what cultural norms and things that frame your sense-making, that make other options seem more plausible than others, more sensible than others. What are the environmental cues that shape your sense-making, that mean that you give your attention to certain things and not others? So for example, does a friend tell you, oh, this Netflix show is really good, which means you're more likely to pick it out than other Netflix shows, because you know someone's already recommended it to you. That's a cue, isn't it? It's going to mean you attend more to that show in the Netflix kind of reel than all the others. And what about your sense of purpose? What about your previous experiences, your relationships, the people that matter to you in your life? How might they feed into the way that you regulate your actions? So the other thing that keeps coming up in questions is when it comes to the self-development plan, some people use the one that I've given out here. Some people go back to the course textbook and try and find it in that. This is just one bit of the whole self-development plan in your course textbook. Don't think that you've got to write out the whole thing. You've only got to write out the bit on self-leadership, these two boxes here. So that's all it is. You don't even need to staple it to your original. You can just type it into the Word document with everything else, okay? Guidelines and advice. This is where I'm going to come to your point on reading. Being able to evidence your understanding of the literature counts, but I do not expect you to read everything on the reading list. There is a huge number of readings, and to an extent, the depth counts more than breadth. So you've only got 1,000 words. If you try and reference every single reading on the list, you're not going to address anything in very much depth, which will probably not go as well as if you had engaged with 5 or 6 or 7 readings in a lot of depth. Okay? So I'm not saying, oh, you must do X number of readings to get a first, because there are people who have done 20 readings and been so overwhelmed with the amount of reading that they've not actually managed to say anything of any depth, which means you don't always come out with such a good grade. So I'm not looking at the references and saying, oh, this person's really well read, therefore the essay must be good. I want to look at the quality of the essay. What have you actually read and understood, and how can you show me that you understood it? So for example, if you use the reading and define self-leadership, that's a good way to start, right? A definition of self-leadership, that's going to really help. If you just reference the definition that I put up there without anything else, I'm going to know that you got it from the lecture slides, aren't I? Because that's what you would do. But if you can demonstrate that you know more than just what I've said on the lecture slide, that actually there's something else that you can tell me about self-leadership beyond the definition, that's going to count for more. So my my advice is be as specific as you can. Don't say, oh, when I was doing my Duke of Edinburgh Award, I did self-leadership, full stop. Because I will want to know, what do you understand by self-leadership? What was it in your Duke of Edinburgh Award that you actually did? What specific self-regulatory practices did you engage in? And what exactly about that challenge was it that meant it required self-leadership of you? So think about what you're going to keep in and what you're going to keep out, because you've only got 1,000 words. Be specific about the challenge and about the reading. Be critical, so weigh up examples. So think about the possibility that self-leadership is not always the answer. That are we, by requiring people to be good self-leaders, are we just putting them on a treadmill that they can't get off? Think about some of those challenges. Make links between different parts of the content, between self-leadership and sense-making, between different readings. Those are the things that no matter what module you take, these are the things that get you a really good grade. And that's advice not just for this particular essay, although it's relevant here, it's good advice for any piece of work that you do here at uni. So be choiceful. Think about, okay, what am I going to prioritize here? It might be that you had a massive challenge, but that actually it's better for you to focus on one tiny bit of it, because otherwise you're going to find yourself having to cover so much ground in 1,000 words. So try and be as detailed, focus on depth, not breadth. Making your word counts. You've got plus or minus 10%. Include everything between the title and the reference list. That includes everything in brackets. Sometimes people think things in brackets don't count. I'm not sure why. I don't know why, but they do count. Everything except your title and your list of references counts in that.
Does your bibliography count?
Your bibliography does not count because that's your list of references, okay? But anything that you write in the body of your text in those paragraphs, that counts, yeah? APA style referencing, guidelines are on ELLI. There's also a really handy A to Z list. So for example, if you want to reference a journal article, you go to J in the list and it tells you how to do it. It's genius. So yeah, that's really, really good, useful stuff to know. Be specific about how you understand the situation. How did you make sense of it? What did you read into that situation? What specifically happened in that challenge that makes it relevant here? What is it about learning to drive or about having to get up for an 8:30 morning that requires you to practice self-leadership? And what self-leadership techniques did you practice? And that will help you answer this third question. Where was your self-leadership evident? What events and things affected your sense-making? So try and avoid generalities. Talk about what specific bit of self-leadership you are meaning at any one time. Are you talking about intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation? Are you talking about goal setting? If so, what kind of goal setting? So I would encourage you to go beyond what your course textbook says about self-leadership and look at the journal articles and things that I have referenced there, because this is year 2 and we should be aiming for a much more rounded understanding of what's going on here. So be critical means be able to challenge yourself. Be ready to challenge what other people say in the literature. Do you disagree with them? If so, why? Is it because you think something else about self-leadership? Maybe you can challenge your own behavior. So maybe you engaged in a practice of self-leadership where things didn't turn out the way you wanted. Sometimes those are the best essays because people have a chance to reflect back and think, oh, I made an assumption that really didn't work out. Maybe have a think about the factors shaping your sense-making. It's not just that I made sense of things and I'm in control of everything I think and do, but we're influenced by other people. And so maybe sometimes when you look back, you hadn't realized that you were being really influenced by something that was happening at the time. But this is a chance to reflect back and think about it again and think, well, actually, I hadn't realized this was going on. You might make link to things elsewhere. So, for example, next week we're going to be talking about purpose. Some of the stuff on purpose might be useful for here. It's not necessary to discuss that in order to get a really good grade, but depending on your self-leadership challenge, you might find it useful to think about the things that matter to you in life, the way you see yourself heading. All of those kinds of things are gonna influence you. Make links between theory and practice, or between different kinds of literature. So do people agree? Do the scholars that we've discussed agree, or do they have different opinions? So for example, some of the self-leadership scholars say, well, actually, what's the difference between self-leadership and self-motivation? Do we need them both? Is one of them redundant? Up to you guys. So where you get better grades is where you draw on the theory, but you don't just repeat. So rather than just repeating, because that's description, that's kind of a descriptive way of using theory to say self-leadership is X, Y, Z. But to be able to say, I applied this aspect of self-leadership in this instance, shows a much more detailed level of analysis. Now have a think about questions like this. What does this reading on self-leadership have to say about your experience? What might you interpret now that you have read that? So be careful here in terms of making choices for what to leave in and what to leave out. You cannot address everything. It's only 1,000 words. It goes very quick. I'm not expecting you to cover everything that we discussed in the lecture here. So my advice is focus. You get a good grade by demonstrating a really in-depth understanding of specific issues. Narrow and deep is way better, as I said before, than 20 references of kind of very superficial level. In terms of tone, people often don't know how to write an essay like this. It might be the first essay you've ever written. It might be the first one you've ever written for the business school. So think about your tone. It's going to be very hard to write without using I, so feel free to use the first person. I'm going to be expecting that for all of the work you do for this module because it's a personalized response. So don't feel like you've got to write in the passive tense or anything. That would be very weird. Write critically, think critically, think about the tone you use, try and avoid slang, try and avoid shortening words from could not to couldn't and things like that, because that makes it sound more thoughtful, makes it sound more engaged. And I guess the last thing I wanted to just go through with you is a reminder that I am going to allow you to use appendices in this assignment. Now, an appendix is usually something that comes after your references that provides additional contextual information. So that means that stuff that you think would help me understand what is going on in the main body of your text. Okay, so your 1,000 words is going to get you the grade. But for example, if you want me to know a bit more detail about your experience and you know that it's going to take you more than 1,000 words just to tell me about that, how about writing that description up in an appendix, and then you can say, when I was on this particular team, I had a self-leadership challenge which related to how I acted in front of my fellow teammates. And it was really important to me for this reason. For more detail, please see Appendix A. And then you've got as many words as you want in Appendix A to expand. Now, bear in mind that what I'm going to mark and award your mark from is your theoretical understanding and your analysis of the situation, which is all going in that 1,000 words. Okay, so I don't want any theory in the appendices. I don't want any description of references or discussion of, what you've read. I just want it to be, if there is a place where you need additional descriptive stuff that relates to your context, you can talk about it there. But anything where you specifically explain about self-leadership, about the tools and techniques you used, that goes in the main body. But for example, some people want to put a newspaper article in as an appendix. Some people choose to put a photograph in so that I can imagine it a bit more. Some people choose to give me a description of what was going on in their life at the time so that they can explain a bit more about their sense-making stuff. That's all up to you. If you have any questions about that, you can come and ask me. But it's worth knowing because I think sometimes it helps you identify what's description and what's analysis, and that's a really useful skill, and that's why I allow you to use appendices, because I think it helps you learn. It helps you learn what's descriptive, kind of superfluous, but kind of useful context, and what is absolutely must know and is part of my proper answer to this question. Okay? So, what is a leadership experience? Well, we already know, right, that you don't have to be a leader to practice leadership. We know already from this module that you practice leadership all over the place in your everyday life, that it could be something enormous, a really big deal that is life-changing for you, or it could be something that is small, that is a gradual process. It does not have to be something really glamorous and exciting. The glamorous, exciting things do not necessarily get you better marks. What gets you good marks is the quality of your reflection and the quality of your understanding. So have a think about where you practice leading yourself in everyday lives as one of these 7 practices. Ignore the stuff on the right-hand side and just think about that one practice of leading yourself, of where you have regulated your actions and your self-understanding in order to achieve something that you wanted to happen. And we've all done that. We all do that all the time. It's just a question of making it conscious, because quite often we take it for granted, right? That's just how people get stuff done. And then next week, we'll go on to looking at how we act with purpose, how we identify a sense of purpose for ourselves, how we go about staying true to that. And we're going to hear from a guest speaker as well, Grace, who is president of the Students' Union. She's going to talk about purpose in an organisation, how big organisations manage to unite people, even though they might have very different agendas. So that might be useful as well for some of you. So have a think about how you analyse the practice of self-leadership. What are the key features you need to be aware of? The how, the what, and the why. Think about those. If you had to describe what you did to someone, what would you tell them? So you might think about what actions you took, what things you put in place to remind you. Did you get someone to hold you accountable for your actions? What got in the way? What were the reasons why you didn't make it? Because quite often we don't. Things that we set ourselves as New Year's resolutions, pretty much we always fail to do. So maybe it's a question of, well, you know what? I set myself this incredibly ridiculous target and I didn't make it. That works too. Have a think on the sense-making front about when and where your sense-making happened. Was it about specific events? So, for example, if you're thinking about coming to university and you were thinking about how to regulate your behaviour, did you learn something at an open day which totally changed your mind? Was it part of an informal process of influence that happened amongst your group of friends? Was it at select meetings with people who were there to give you advice? Is your sense-making conscious or unconscious? Is it in the past? Is something from 7 or 8 years ago still having an impact on your sense-making now? Quite often, the things that are most meaningful, that stick with us the longest, are these really fundamental things that happened to us way back when we were kids. So understanding your sense-making is about thinking about your cues. What cues from your environment, from your current situation, did you identify? What helped you navigate? What landmarks from your life have you picked out that are going to help you interpret what you're going to do? And how did that help you to make choices in terms of regulating your behaviour? What about the frames, the big frames that I've told you about, the cultural norms, the expectations of your parents, the way that religion can shape the way we understand the world and the way we understand relationships with other people? All of these things have a huge influence, not just on one decision we make, but big decisions all over our life. Those are frames. The small things that influence just one piece of the puzzle, those are cues. So, good places to start for self-leadership. I'm going to skim over those now because this is all on Ellie for you. And I want to draw your attention to Ellie a little bit, just so that you know where to find everything. Ooh. Okay, so this is your Ellie page. This is kind of what it looks like for you, more or less. There are these series of tiles down here. All your assignment info is in this section. So, for example, guide to referencing, here and here. Assignment brief 1, frequently asked questions, self-leadership plan. Okay, so everything to do with your assessments is here. And then your section on self-leadership is here. And you can see that there's loads of different readings. There's also a sense-making revision video here, a recap of the sense-making lecture here. There is all kinds of stuff. Important sense-making points. This is the crib sheet. It's going to be super useful. And the workshop details of the assignment are here. So there's lots of stuff available for you on Ellie. And I also want to just draw your attention to this video I made, which loads of people found useful last year because they were struggling to get through the university's paywall or the publisher's paywalls to access the articles. So if you click on that, it'll show you what links you need to click on to get through to the actual journal article. That should work for you just fine. Okay. The last thing I want to just mention is feedback. I am really up for giving you guys as much help as I am possibly allowed to do and is fair. So please email me with your questions. If you have an idea for something